Okay.
So who are you?
Okay. My name is Michael Rees. I'm a program manager here in the SQL Server engine team doing XML. I've joined Microsoft about 6.5 years ago for the expressive purpose of doing XML in databases, and I've been doing that ever since. I also represent Microsoft in some standards environments such as the XQuery working group, the one that never finishes, as some people call it, and the ANSI SQL standardization group. Too.
Right. And what kind of work are you doing now? I mean, XML has really taken off over the last year or so. I mean,
so mainly, basically, we are now readying SQL Server 2005 for shipping, finally later this year, and so I'm kind of helping closing out the latest box that we have, and working on some giving talks everywhere, so Tech at Europe, PDC, and so on, and also thinking a little bit about what we want to do next, and watching the competition too.
Yep. Now, how is XML used in databases, and how is the use of databases changing because of XML?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I think there is kind of there are a couple of camps on what people want to do with XML, and I hope at some point they will converge. So the easiest first kind of approach is, which is I think is the main use case, is you have relational data inside your database. And you have all these kind of web services and places where you want to use XML as the data exchange format. So people want to get the data that is not in XML format out into an XML format, transport it somewhere, and then when it gets that relational data comes back in XML format, they want to take that XML and shred it back into relational form, basically. And that's kind of what we started to support already in our current release, SQL Server 2000, about 5 years ago now. A bit long, and that some people think that's all what relational databases should do with XML data. I tend to disagree with that because XML is more than just a serialization format; it's a markup format and so on. And so many people also want to take the XML, put it into a database, and just manage it as an XML document. And as such, you need to have an ability to deal with it beyond just tabular form, because you don't want to store it just as a blob, because you still want to have access to the structure. You want to be able to query it, you might want to be able to update it, etc. So you want to reason about what you have inside your documents, which is, I think, one of the promises that XML can give you, is that it allows you to do that, much more so than TeX or LaTeX or a binary Word format, etc.
Yeah.
And so basically, having the XML inside the database gives you the ability to use your query processing that a database engine provides, use the backup, restore, management, deployment ability that a database provides, and bring that to your XML documents, and combine your XML documents with the relational information that you have inside the database, and basically maybe combine it to something more interesting, new stuff, and so on. Now, obviously, one of the things you might still want to do is you might want to propagate properties out of that XML document into a relational column or things like that, so that you can more easily combine it. But basically, the value proposition here is that you can manage your data regardless of whether it's XML or relational within one management framework, and get the same kind of declarative query capabilities over both the relational and the XML data, and combine the two together. Now, I think with SQL Server 2005 we have taken a certain step into that direction. I don't think we're done yet. And if I see what our competition is doing, so they're kind of now also doing the same stuff, and in some areas they are now charging a little bit ahead of us because they have basically a little bit longer until they ship, like IBM, or in the case of Oracle they have way more people working on that stuff.
Yep.
But I think the whole industry is moving in that direction, and so the interesting part is that the people that have been very relational-centric in nature, they have been kind of overtaken by what the customers want to be able to do, what the industry thinks that the customer wants to be doing in the future as well.
Right.
And I think that value proposition is starting to play. And what I hope is that it will allow us to kind of bridge that gap between people that manage documents and people that manage basically rectangular data, and allow them to benefit from each other.
Right. Now, I'm a beginner at the database world.
Yeah.
What do I need to know about XML? What do I need to know about SQL Server that's coming up, and what do I need to know about XML to get started?
Yes. So before I tell you what you need to know is, since you're a beginner, what would you want to use a database for from your point of view?
Maybe storing, my favorite record album, let's say.
Okay, for record albums.
I'm thinking I'm going to use it maybe to build a weblog tool, a news service maybe. So I'm sucking down RSS feeds and putting them in a database. And
well, I'm not surprised about that.
I read 1,300 feeds a night, and I'm thinking, well, I can't keep this going forever, so I need an automated system to do it.
I have only about 100, and that's already way too many.
Yeah.
So what you want to do is basically a database engine in general, whether it's relational or XML, basically gives you a mechanism of hopefully store your data and have a scaling way of finding things using a declarative query language. And it gives you backup, recovery, restore capabilities. So if you, for example, if your program crashes, the data is still there and things like that. Although if your disk crashes, you might have some problem.
Yeah.
So what you want to do basically then is take your RSS feeds, load them into the database, and you can basically run your own queries over them. So as you know, you can go to places like blog lines and stuff like that to basically do kind of subscriptions, which I would consider them to continue to do, but sometimes they're a little bit out of date. It takes a while until you basically see what has been done. If you get the feeds directly and put them in, you can run queries over the data in slightly different, more complex ways. Now, one thing that you might want to do is just full text index the thing, in which case xQuery, for example, doesn't come into play, and you could actually store it either as a blob or as an XML data type. But you might want to have more structured queries like find me all the postings that have to do with XYZ within a certain time frame or so. And unlike your RSS aggregators where you normally kind of drop stuff off after a while, since it's in the database, you can keep the history around as well on that. And at some point, you might want to combine the data with other information that you put into the database, and so you can repurpose that information more easily in different contexts, which is one of the problems you have once it's inside an RSS aggregator reader or something like that. Then it basically is in there, and if you want to combine it with something else, you have to pull it out again and start combining it with other things. And if you have everything inside the database, then basically the data that's in the database can be combined with other data in the database that originally you might not have seen a connection with. So your record albums, for example, you could at some point, if you have weblogs that you read about the recording industry or something like that, at some point you might want to combine information out of your record albums with that.
Yep. Now, if I'm a more advanced database user and maybe I'm using the existing SQL Server or MySQL or Oracle or whatnot, what do I need to know about Microsoft's approach to XML? How would I need to change my skills, or what would I need to know about what you guys have been doing?
Okay, that's a good question, and I have to give you 3 answers for that depending on what database system you're mentioning. If you move from SQL Server 2000 to 2005, I think the main take-home point there is that what you have been doing in SQL Server 2000 still works in 2005. We have basically added functionality to deal with natively storing XML using the XML data type and be able to query over that, etc. But your previous shredding, publishing mechanisms that we offered in SQL Server 2000 still works. So that means what we also have added improvements on that. There is a new for XML mode, which is called for XML path mode, that we have added, which makes writing more complex publishing functions easier. We used to use SQL Server 2000 had this for XML explicit mode, which I sometimes call the query from hell. And that's a very complex SQL query to write to get your XML out, but it's quite efficient and quite effective. But you needed to be quite skilled at writing such queries and so on. And the path mode makes it much easier. although sometimes the explicit mode might still be faster based on some of the processing that it's doing. If you go from MySQL to SQL Server, the interesting part is that MySQL hasn't really done much in XML support. So yes, if you want to do XML support and are using MySQL, come and use, for example, SQL Server Express, which is our free desktop developer version, which has all the XML support in as well. If you look at Oracle, I think Oracle and us are, interestingly enough, have kind of following the same path. Partially, that's obviously because we're all collaborating in the xQuery working group. We are collaborating in the SQL standardization environment where XML is being done. The main differences that I would say at the moment is, at some point, is that Oracle is planning, at least with the release that is coming out soon, the 10GR2, they already have more of the standard syntax than we have. We both have the standard XML data type, and at that level it's quite similar, due to the fact that they have more legacy history in that sense. They have the type for a longer while, and they have more storage options, which on the one hand makes it more flexible, on the other hand makes it much more complex to understand which ones of those 5 options should I actually choose for storing my data, and then changing it might become a little bit more difficult over time. And so I think we have a little bit the simpler story there, although some people would say maybe it's too simplistic, but I'd rather start simple and then add on instead of starting complex and then try to prune down.
Yeah.
The other thing that they have is, as I mentioned, they have more standard syntax, so they have these XML publishing functions, which I actually don't like. I find our path mode much nicer, and since we have shipped for XML way before there was even a standard in the XML SQL space, we have not invested much time into being standards compliant there. Obviously, if customers would ask us to become more standards compliant, or if we see that as being basically blocking us from getting people off from Oracle and moving to SQL Server, we certainly will consider adding support for that as well at some point, but not in 2005.
Right. What are the 3 key advantages for XML for developers and databases?
Okay,
if you're talking to developers, like, why would I use XML?
So my basic message normally is that you have a couple of scenarios in which you use XML. And now, if you are using a database already for manage your other data, then I think it makes sense to put the data all into one place instead of having part of it in a file system and part of it in the database. And so if you're taking all the data into the database, then obviously having an XML-enabled database is valuable. Now, some of the scenarios there are like document scenarios, like especially now with OpenOffice and Word,
the new
Office 12, having XML as their native form will be a good way of storing, managing your XML in one place.
Can SQL Server write to the new Office file format and store it in the zip file?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay.
Although first writing it into the XML format, that's a little bit hard to do because you normally generate the XML by marking it up in Word by making something bold or something like that. So automatically publishing your relational data into that format is not something we can easily do. I mean, but on the other hand, we have our default views of exporting XML, and people can, since that's just XML, they can load it into Office and then start messing with it in that context, or Excel or whatever. Excel is probably a little bit more appropriate for that type of data. And you can, if you give me a Word document in XML form, I can store that and allow you to query over it. With the zipping and unzipping, that's something that we currently don't have directly. You can use our mid-tier or built-in CLR support for example, doing the unzip part and so on. If you have a library that does zip and unzip, you can do it this way. It's something that we probably will look at in future release, how we can better make that a seamless integration.
Now, is there a reason not to use XML?
Yes.
Stick with binary.
Sure. There are
Performance,
reasons like
or what? What are
well,
some
it
of the
depends
reasons?
on the data. If your data is not originally in XML form, there's probably not a reason to go and just put XML on unless you have
You wouldn't
other business.
convert a JPEG, for instance,
Yes,
to XML, right?
exactly. So unless there's a good business reason for doing so, like in the interrupt scenario, then you might want to put data that is not in XML into XML form. And that's for transport. For storage, for example, if you just have really relational information like customer order details type stuff, and you don't really need XML at all, don't try to fit it into XML and store it in XML just because it's cool. That's certainly a bad idea. Even if it's sometimes in XML, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's better just to propagate it out. So, for example, if you have, let's assume you have, for some reason, purchase order and customer information, like customer with its purchase order in an XML hierarchy, because that's the way that you got it from your data provider. So, if you want to store it in a database, you might often want to repurpose the information. Like you want to just run reports over the customers, no information about purchase order needed, or you want to run it over just purchase order information without ever knowing what customers really are associated with those purchase orders. If you want to do that type of stuff, then if you decompose it into relational form, you still have an easier way of repurposing the information, because you now only look at purchase order. You don't care about the other stuff anymore. In the XML context, since you have to navigate through the customer to the purchase order, you always have this additional step to make. Now, yes, there are ways of optimizing that, but I don't think that the infrastructure is there yet to make that as efficient and as seamless as you might want it to be from a relational background.
Right.
So in that case, keep it relational. And obviously every data format like your MPEG and JPEG and all kinds of other things that are still binary, obviously you don't want to have them translated into XML if they don't fit in there.
Yep.
On the other hand, I don't think that some of the XML stuff should be made binary, which is a whole other topic.
What else do we need to know about what the world of XML and databases?
I think the interesting aspect will be to see how actually people are going to use XML to solve their business problems, and how they are going to, and whether the infrastructure and the direction we are going is enabling or limiting in that sense. I hope it will be both. I hope it will be enabling in the sense that people can do new stuff, and it will be limiting so that we can provide more stuff for people to basically, that they push the boundary of what we offer, and so give us kind of an incentive of becoming better and providing more support.
Right.
In that or in other areas. I mean, it doesn't have to be only XML inside the database.
Are you coming to the PDC?
I just got an email last night that I should be talking there, so I will be there, yes.
Excellent. And you'll be talking about XML and SQL Server, I assume?
I assume so, yes. I can talk about other stuff too, but I think that's probably...
So what else do you do on the team?
Well, as a program manager, obviously, kind of do typical program management stuff, like helping my developers manage dependencies. So basically make sure that they can do their job and keep them away from having to do the stuff they don't want to do.
Yeah.
And I kind of, I mean, I'm primarily currently in the XML space.
When you say dependencies,
well, like
Visual Studio team, for instance.
I don't necessarily deal with Visual Studio team at the moment, but there are other things like, for example, dependencies between our mid-tier component and us. We, for example, use some components that the XML team has been doing, like their XML parser, and so kind of coordinating with them, communicating our needs to them, and getting their needs back to my developers, basically. There are also things like dependencies from external components that might have dependencies on us. So I'm going to talk to them and basically say, well, that's what you can do, and this is what you can't do with it, and take kind of the information back and aggregate it. Other stuff is, as I mentioned, I mean, I'm for example going to Tech at Europe next week, and I'm going to give my presentation that I gave at Tech in Orlando this year, but I'm also going to give 2 other presentations, one about Service Broker and one about mid-tier caches. It will be a hard act to follow. Pablo Castro is a very good presenter. Fortunately, he's not going to, and so I took up his presentation. And so obviously there is other stuff that I have interest in and can talk about, but at the moment the main focus is really the XML stuff in SQL Server and next version of SQL Server when we'll be looking at what we can do.
Now, is there any security or privacy things that you need to think about when you go to XML?
Yes, there are, I mean, privacy is kind of the same in all the cases. When you publish data out of a database, you need to be able to make sure that the data that you publish goes only to people that are supposed to be seeing that data. I don't want to see my credit card or social security numbers published, but that doesn't matter whether it's an XML form or not. I mean, the issue is the same. On the security side, there is one interesting scenarios that I think many of the security people have been kind of grappling with or just start to grapple with, which is if you normally when you get data into a database, you normally get the data from some program, like this typical client-server type thing. So you have the client, and you either trust the client or you don't trust the client. And if you don't trust the client, you normally don't allow him to talk to the database because he needs to get authenticated against the database. Now, with the more 3-tiered architecture data interrupt scenario where you basically say, I give you data in XML form, and you navigate that through your mid-tier into the database. Now what can happen is that basically you normally may not look at the payload that comes in XML form. And so you have to make sure that however your XML document looks like is actually well suited and doesn't contain what I would consider malicious XML formats. Now what does that mean, malicious XML formats? Well, the first case is if you just look at the XML markup, the pointy brackets and the data in between, well, you get XML and you probably want to do something with the XML, so you might want to do validation against it. And if you do validation, yeah, normally the data, as long as the size of the data message is of some acceptable size, at some point it will say, well, it's valid or not valid. So yeah, it's a question of how big the data is that you accept, and it's normally linear to that.
Yeah.
However, if you add support for DTDs, it becomes a little bit more problematic.
DTDs are
the XML 1.0 mechanism of providing schema information in the document and entities. So if you remember HTML, you had like when you wanted to put in an A umlaut, for example,
yep.
You had to use that ampersand AUML semicolon. That's what's called an entity. And you can, in XML, there is much less predefined entities, but you can define your own.
Okay.
And that's done also as part of a DTD. Now, DTDs can be internal or external, or a mixture of them. And there are different categories of entities I don't want to get into. But basically what happens is if you take your lower level entities externally and get it from somewhere else, you basically have to trust the URL that is in there. And as everyone knows, just trusting URL might not be a good idea. So,
yeah.
So to address that, for example, in SQL Server 2000, we don't allow support for external DTDs because we just decided that doing that is too risky. If people really want to do that, they can do that on the mid-tier before they send the data in. Now, for internal DTDs that are within the same data package, you would think, well, there's not a big issue there because everything is in one context, which is not quite true. Now, DTDs obviously themselves need to be compiled and so on, but that's probably not such a big deal. It's like a schema language. But the entity now are more complex because you can define more complex entities. I mean, the example I gave with a umlaut is basically just defining a character. So that's a very easy entity. But many people in the XML document world have used entities to basically do parameterized entities, to have entities defined on other entities. So that can become very complex. It's like a macro language. And the problem is that there are some complexities in there that have been used to attack XML parsers. And some of these attacks can lead to very basically CPU exploitations, memory exploitations, and things like that, mainly denial of service attack scenarios. And that's much harder to deal with because, on the one hand, people want to use entities. On the other hand, if you support arbitrary entities, and you don't know what the customers actually want to do with the entities, you are under threat of having, for example, what we call an entity expansion attack. So how do you guard against that? Well, the easiest thing to guard against it is basically say, per default, we don't allow you to look at even internal DTDs, and that's what we do with our XML parser, for example. But in some circumstances, since the entity declaration still some people want to have that, we basically give them an option of turning that on. And if we give that option, then obviously the question becomes, how do we make sure that that there is kind of that the user is aware of that he might have to mitigate such attacks, which means that he actually will have to, for example, do some checks himself on the mid-tier. So he just can't take the XML from whatever source and pass it into the database. That's certainly one thing that people should be willing to do. Another thing is that the way that we code our entity expansion is done that we minimize the denial of service attack scenarios by making sure that we yield to other processes, make sure that there is some way of potentially at some point discover if we get into such a situation. Although discovering is always bad because at some point people that want to attack will go back and make it differently. So at the moment the main recommendation is basically do not use entities and DTDs if you are not 100% sure about the provenance of your XML data. If you need entity support, DTD I think can be replaced with XML schemas, but if you need entity support, you probably better make sure that you work with the people that send the data and to be able to mitigate the threat, basically saying, well, if I see an entity that is not defined in a certain way, then we don't accept the document or something like that. So there is a little bit of, unfortunately, a little bit of a cost associated to the user at this stage. We are looking at improving that, but that's probably not SQL Server 2005 item. I'm still fighting for it, but we'll see.
Very cool. Did you have any demos or anything to show?
Sure, I can.
Oh, you do? Good.
Yeah, sure.
What are you going to show?
Very. Well, actually, I can just show you a little bit of code. Unfortunately, I don't really have like any cool application of it, which would be nice. But,
all right.
So I have. You can see that.
Yeah.
So this is just SQL Server Management Studio here. And let's just open a new query here, database engine query. So what I can do here is I can just create some table here. Table, let's call it T. Let's add X column called XML. So that's the easiest thing you can do to get XML into your database. So now I've created a table with XML, and I can insert into that. So let's say insert into T values, and let's we have made string constants to be automatically cursible into XML, or string and binary values in general. And so in this case, I just give you a simple XML document here. Let's say doc, and what is that? Channel 9 date equals, what do we have today? 2005-06-27C. Or just say, well, yeah, put a C here. We'll explain that right away. Robert is here, taping, and let's put some markup in here. Interview guest Michael. Interview guest. And now if I would use our XML editor, I would actually have IntelliSense and so on. So
yep.
Obviously I'm still an old VI hack. More than, okay, let's close this. So that's channel 9 doc. If I just execute this statement here, oh, as I see, incorrect syntax near. Oh, this is T-SQL syntax, as you can see here. Okay, now I inserted my XML document.
Yep.
And let's now quickly see how that looks like. Select star from T. If I execute this, you see now that I can get an XML editor opened up here by just clicking on it. People coming from SQL Server 2000 will like that, I hope. And this is now just an XML editor here, so you see the same document that I had before. An interesting aspect here is that the XML data type can be more than just a document. So this is a valid document,
yep.
but or well-formed document. I can now go and, for example, say, well, I actually also want to, maybe you do more than one such interview today,
yep.
and so I just will add something that I call a fragment. Let's assume I have, for some reason I don't have the doc element anymore, let's say, just to make it a little bit more believable. Let's say I don't want to have the doc element there, and I just add another interview guest. I don't know, what is your favorite name here?
Oh, Steve Ballmer.
Okay, oh yeah, sure. Steve Ballmer, okay. And I insert this element now, and if I select the same same table, now you see 2 rows here, each one containing an XML document, and this XML document is actually a fragment. And the editor actually complains here. If you go close enough, you will see XML document cannot contain multiple root element.
Got it.
Which the document cannot, but the XML data type can.
Interesting.
And the reason why the XML data type can that is because when you do publishing of XML, construct XML documents, you want to have more than one top-level element on intermediate results because you want to combine them up. So you want to get the list of all your customers. But you don't want to necessarily have a customer wrapper element around it, which I find to be one of the main problems of XML schema design, is that people always want to have these containers there that are just containers. If you have properties on the containers, fine. But if you don't have, why bother? And so, yeah, an XML data type obviously needs to be able to be composable, so it allows you to do that. So let's say I want to have this now as a single document, and I want to have everything in one document. So let's put everything together, and I can do that by combining a little bit 4 XML queries together with XQuery documents. So let's say I want to get all my channel 9 elements together. And so what I can say is I can say select x.query / channel 9. Now what this is it's an XPath or XQuery expression. The query method here is a syntactic way of applying this XQuery expression onto my XML data type. And if I say, oops, from T, I'm a terrible speller as a typist, as you can see. Now I still get 2 rows, but I got rid of my doc root element there.
Got it.
So what I now want to do is I want to aggregate that. So I say for XML. So this is what I did in SQL Server 2000. In SQL Server 2000 I might have said for XML auto or something like that. If I do that, I'm getting lots of wrappers around it as well. So now I have only one result. But now I have this wrapper T around it by channel 9s, and that's not what I want. And in SQL Server 2000, I would have to write a for XML explicit query, etc. Now it's much simpler. I can say for XML path, don't give a name to the resulting element.
Yeah.
now I'm getting all my channel 9s here, as you can see.
Great.
So now let's put a wrapper around it. Now I cannot put a wrapper around here because that's on a per row basis. So I have what we call a root property. So I say doc, and so this one gives me now the ability to have my document with my XML all in there.
Oh wow.
Now my problem is I have you tape me twice here. So let's add maybe Bill to it as well.
Okay.
So let's replace the on the second row. Let's replace Michael with Bill. Now the problem is, as you can see, is there is no property in the relational context that allows me to go and say, let me do that. Now I could alter the table, add another column, and add a relational identifier for the row. Or what I can do is I can run a query and try to identify my XML document that I want to change. And since the XML document that I want to change has Steve Ballmer as an interview guest as well, I can use that inside a predicate. So let's see if I can do that. Obviously, update in sequels are done using an update statement. So I say update t set, and now the XML column is modify. And what I want to do is I want to say replace value of something with, and I replace the value with basically a string constant called Bill G. Now what do I have to change here? And then I have to put a predicate here as well, where X exists, and I say basically somewhere there is slash what is it, interview guest dot, let's see, that might work, interview guest slash dot equals Steve Ballmer. So maybe let's just run the predicate first, huh? So let's put in select star from T. And this one needs to be compared with 1 because we don't have Boolean types in SQL, unfortunately. So this shows me one row. That's the row I want to change. So I think I'm fine. So I want to go and replace this with Bill G, as I mentioned. So now I know which row I have, and now I have to find out which part inside my inside the document. And I know that it's the interview guest where I have Michael Reese. So I say channel 9 slash interview guest. Now this is a text node I'm going to replace, so let me just use the text node here. And I again say dot equals Michael. So let's see what happens here. Remove that select here. Okay. Now I'm getting static typing error. So what this means now is it says the target of replace must be at most one node, but it found multiple text nodes. Well, why did it find multiple text nodes? Well, I don't know how many channel 9s I have. I don't know how many interview guests I have. And I don't know how many text nodes underneath the interview guests I have. So what I have to add is I have to say, well, I know that there's only one, and so let's just force it to be one statically. And I do that by putting a bracket 1 at the end here. So here you see I added bracket 1. And if I execute this now it knows exactly which one, and it will actually do it. So let's look at what we have here. Just run the query that I had before. Now I see that the interview guest is Bill G. So this is kind of the functionality that you have. So you can query, you can aggregate, you can update, etc. You still have to combine relational statements with XQuery statements. That's something that I would actually encourage the listeners to provide us feedback with if they're finding it important to have, for example, only what we call top-level XQuery, in which case you would operate over a set of XML documents only with XQuery, how much important that is, so that we can take that, for example, for planning of our next releases. There's also additional stuff. I mean, this was just a toy example. Obviously, if you need more complex data, you might want to use schemas to enforce the validity of the data.
Right.
So if you go back to the example document here, you see that I put a Z at the end of my date here. If you would have a schema that defines that as an access date, for example, according to the XML schema type, we have an implementation limitation in SQL Server 2005 that says that we only support those with time zones.
Got it.
So you have to put a time zone there, and Z is just as good as the time zone on the date as any other time zone. Don't ask me why you need time zones on dates anyway, but that's a different question. And
well, because
well, yeah, it's
is it Monday or Tuesday?
Well,
you're in
yeah,
China, it's already Tuesday, right?
Well, that's true, but most people that just use dates don't really care about that part.
Yeah.
So this is one aspect here, that if you put a schema on this, you obviously then would want to have the schema say that the date has to be of date time, and then this is a valid representation. Otherwise, the validation would fail.
Right.
Another thing you might want to do is you might want to define indices.
Which one?
Indices. So one thing in databases is an index is like in a book.
Okay.
If you want to find something quick, instead of looking at every page, you open the index, find the keyword, and basically go and look up directly on that page. And databases have a similar mechanism.
Okay.
And these indices basically allow the query optimizer to look up where to find the data more efficiently. Instead of having to scan through the whole table, it will then now have a pointer that it knows which page to look it up at, etc. And we have a couple of such XML indices as well. And I mean, we have done lots of webcasts on MSDN that explain that, and maybe we should put a link there for people to follow up on and basically get a little bit more information.
What page is a good website to go to for information?
The best one, obviously, I'm a little bit biased, is my weblog, because I have links to most of the white papers.
You're on blogs.msdn.com?
Actually, no, I'm SQLchunkist.com. I have also one on blogs.msdn.com, which is kind of an aggregator where I kind of publish stuff that is relevant to this as well, so you can go either way. So it's either blogs.msdn.com/mrys, or it's SQLchunkist.com/weblog/mrys.
Okay.
And
then does the SQL Server team have a website for XML?
Yeah, well, SQL Server, there's a general SQL Server website, both on TechNet and MSDN. Don't ask me why we have to. I think that in the database world, actually, there are more people that are both IT professionals and developers at some point. Like a database administrator is normally also somebody who knows how to program in T-SQL and so on. And so on MSDN.com/MSDN Microsoft.com/SQL, or at the TechNet relevance, or even at www.microsoft.com/SQL, you will find links to SQL Server stuff, including the XML stuff.
Okay.
Okay, so I don't know, any questions you have about the demo, anything else you want to see?
No, if we keep going, we'll write an aggregator here.
Yeah, that's true.
No, thanks for spending 40 minutes with me and giving me a little look inside. And people can ask you questions in your blog. Sure. That's just to give a high-level overview.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you guys are interested in it, and if there are any questions about that, I'm more than willing to help you.
And we'll see you at the PDC too.
I will be at the PDC if everything works fine. Yeah, I'm on vacation before that, so you never know. Maybe I get eaten by a shark.
I hope not.
Okay.
Thanks.